Chapter 32. Convergence. Kale positioned himself in the pre-dawn darkness across from Master Chen's estate, concealed in the shadow of an abandoned carriage house that provided clear sight lines to both the main entrance and the garden walls. The weight of his decision to observe rather than approach pressed against his chest. 7 years of careful network building had taught him that patience often revealed more than action. Hours passed in motionless vigilance. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, movement caught his eye. A side door he hadn't even noticed, so perfectly integrated into the estate's stone wall that it appeared to be merely decorative carving, opened with silent precision. Rose emerged first, her silhouette unmistakable despite the years that had passed. She moved with the fluid confidence he remembered, but there was something new in her bearing. An awareness of space and threat that suggested capabilities beyond what she'd possessed as an information broker. Her companion followed a moment later, the tall, blonde human Taven had described. Even in the dim light, Kale could see this was someone accustomed to danger, his movements carrying the controlled grace of a trained fighter. More intriguingly, he carried what appeared to be a rifle, but its design was unlike the energy weapons Black Dawn had been deploying. This weapon had an organic quality to it, with crystalline components that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Rose paused at the doorway, her hand resting on what looked like a small crystalline device attached to the doorframe. Light pulsed briefly between her fingers, and Kale realized she was disabling some kind of alarm system with a precision that spoke of intimate familiarity with Chen's security measures. The pair moved through the estate's garden with practiced stealth, but instead of heading toward an exit, they turned toward the city center. Kale adjusted his position to maintain visual contact, realizing they were making their way toward the House of Silver Mirrors. He followed at a careful distance, using the pre-dawn shadows and his knowledge of Concordia's back alleys to remain undetected. The route Rose chose was deliberate, avoiding main thoroughfares where early Black Dawn patrols might spot them, but moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. When they reached the House of Silver Mirrors, Rose approached a side entrance with the same casual familiarity she'd shown at Chen's estate. Darren positioned himself to watch for threats while maintaining a grip on his unusual weapon, the rifle's crystalline components pulsing faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. Rose produced another small device and placed it against the entrance's locking mechanism. Again, light pulsed between her fingers, and the door opened silently. They slipped inside with practiced efficiency, leaving Kale to wonder what business they could possibly have in the heavily fortified heart of Black Dawn's Concordian operations. 20 minutes after Rose and Darren had entered the House of Silver Mirrors, new movement appeared from another direction. 4 figures in the distinctive enhanced armor of Black Dawn's elite units approached the same building, but from the main entrance. Behind them, moving with careful authority, came Lady Vess. She wore travelling clothes rather than formal attire, and her bearing carried a tension that suggested she was operating outside her normal comfort zone. More telling was the way the enhanced soldiers deferred to her, not with casual respect, but with the focused attention reserved for someone issuing direct operational orders. Lady Vess approached the main entrance of her own residence with what appeared to be official purpose, the enhanced soldiers flanking her as she unlocked the heavily secured doors. They entered with the systematic precision of a search operation, unaware that 2 intruders were already somewhere inside the sprawling complex. 15 minutes passed in tense silence. Kale maintained his observation post, every sense alert for signs of discovery or conflict. The House of Silver Mirrors showed no external indication of the drama unfolding within its walls, just the usual complement of guards at their posts and the faint glow of magical wards that had protected the estate for decades. Then the world exploded. A thunderous roar erupted from the upper floors of the house, so powerful that Kale felt it as much as heard it. The sound rolled across Concordia like the voice of an angry god, rattling windows and setting dogs, howling throughout the district. Before the echoes could fade, a second roar followed, then a third, each accompanied by brilliant flashes of light that blazed through the tall windows of what Cale knew to be the administrative offices. The flashes weren't the clean, sterile light of Black Dawn's energy weapons. These were wild, chaotic bursts that painted the windows in shades of fire and lightning, the kind of raw magical discharge that spoke of powers being unleashed without restraint or precision. Immediately, alarms began blaring throughout the compound, not the measured tones of routine security alerts, but the urgent, discordant wail that meant genuine emergency. Emergency lights blazed to life along the estate's perimeter, and magical defensive systems that had lain dormant for years suddenly flared into visibility. Black Dawn troops came running from every direction. Soldiers poured out of the barracks, guards abandoned their posts to converge on the main building, and even off-duty personnel emerged from the residential quarters with weapons in hand. The response was immediate and overwhelming, dozens of soldiers racing toward what had been Concordia's most secure location. Cale pressed himself deeper into the shadows as soldiers rushed past his concealment, their faces showing the kind of controlled panic that came from facing threats beyond their training. Some carried the new energy rifles, others bore conventional weapons, but all moved with the desperate urgency of people who understood that their world was under attack. The upper windows of the house continued to pulse with intermittent flashes of light, and occasional tremors shook the building's ancient foundations. Whatever battle was being fought in those administrative offices, it was being waged with powers that threatened the structural integrity of the entire complex. As more soldiers disappeared into the House of Silver Mirrors, Cale realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. The seat of Black Dawn's power in Concordia was under assault from within, and the attackers were proving capable of matching or exceeding the defenders' capabilities. The question was whether Rose and Darren would be able to complete whatever mission had brought them here, or whether they would become casualties of a confrontation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The morning's careful observations had become a front-row seat to what might be the most significant battle fought in Concordia since the original occupation. And somewhere in the chaos of flashing lights and thunderous roars, the balance of power was shifting in ways that would reshape everything. The thunderous roars continued to shake the House of Silver Mirrors, but now Cale could see the flashes of light moving through the building like a violent storm. What had begun in the upper administrative offices was cascading downward. Brilliant bursts illuminating windows on the second floor, then the first, the chaotic magical discharge following what could only be a running battle. Cale moved carefully along his side of the street, using the cover of early morning shadows and the distraction of soldiers rushing towards the main entrance. His military training guided his movements: stay low, use available concealment, maintain situational awareness while focusing on the objective. The objective being the side entrance Rose and Darren had used to enter the compound. As he approached the mouth of the alley, Cale spotted exactly what he'd expected: two Black Dawn soldiers positioned in concealment on either side of the side entrance. They were alert, weapons ready, clearly positioned to ambush whoever emerged from that door. Their placement was professional: good sight lines, effective cover, overlapping fields of fire. The flashes of light were now visible on the ground floor, accompanied by sounds that suggested the battle was moving toward the building's lower levels. Whatever Rose and Darren were fighting, they were either being driven toward the exit or fighting their way there deliberately. The side door burst open with explosive force, the heavy wood slamming against the alley wall, hard enough to crack the stone. Darren emerged first, his magically enhanced shotgun already raised and tracking toward the nearest threat. The weapon roared with a sound like thunder trapped in steel. Fire erupted from the barrel as a 2-ounce slug slammed into the chest of the closest Black Dawn trooper with devastating force. The impact lifted the soldier completely off his feet, his body sailing through the air for 20 feet before crashing into the alley's far wall with bone-breaking impact. Rose stepped through the doorway immediately behind Darren, but she wasn't alone. Her left hand gripped Lady Vess by the arm, dragging the noble woman along with unmistakable force. Lady Vess stumbled, her face showing shock and terror, clearly not a willing participant in whatever had just transpired. The second Black Dawn guard raised his energy rifle, but Rose was faster. Her right hand extended toward him, and a stream of fire erupted from her fingers like liquid flame given form. The magical fire engulfed the trooper completely. His screams cut short as the intense heat reduced him to ash in seconds. Cale stood motionless in his concealment, shocked by the speed and brutal efficiency of what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't the Rose Emberheart he remembered, the information broker who'd relied on networks and negotiation. This was someone who killed with casual expertise, whose magical abilities had been honed into weapons of terrifying precision. Rose shoved Lady Vess forward, her voice carrying deadly authority. "Move, or become ash." Lady Vess stumbled forward, her elegant composure shattered by whatever she'd experienced inside her own residence. Behind them, Darren maintained a defensive position, his enhanced shotgun trained on the doorway they'd just exited. A third Black Dawn trooper rounded the corner of the alley, his energy rifle already charging. Darren's response was immediate. The shotgun boomed again, and the trooper dropped with a massive wound in his chest, his weapon clattering unfired to the cobblestones. At the far end of the alley, space itself began to shimmer and twist. A portal tore open in the air, not the crude rift technology Draven used, but something more elegant and precise. The edges glowed with the distinctive silver light that marked House of Night Whisper's portal work, one of their secret gateways that bypassed conventional detection. Rose pushed Lady Vess toward the portal while Darren continued covering their retreat. Through. Now. Lady Vess hesitated, looking back at her burning residence with an expression of loss and bewilderment. Rose's patience lasted exactly 2 seconds before she grabbed the woman again and forced her through the portal opening. Darren backed toward the gateway, his shotgun still trained on potential threats, then stepped through himself. Rose followed last, pausing only to look back at the chaos they were leaving behind. For a moment, her eyes swept the alley, and Cale held his breath as her gaze passed over his hiding spot. But she showed no sign of detecting his presence, and a second later, she disappeared through the portal. The gateway snapped closed with a sound like breaking glass, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and the smoking remains of what had been 3 elite Black Dawn soldiers. Cale remained motionless for several more minutes, processing what he'd witnessed. Rose and Darren had infiltrated the most secure building in Concordia, fought their way through enhanced troops and magical defenses, and kidnapped Lady Vess, all while using weapons and abilities that exceeded anything he'd thought possible. The House of Night Whispers had provided extraction support, confirming that Rose's operations had backing from one of the most powerful covert organizations in the Connected Realms. Most significantly, Lady Vess was now in the hands of people who had just demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. As alarms continued to wail and soldiers poured through the House of Silver Mirrors, searching for enemies who were already realms away, Cale understood that everything had changed. The careful balance of power that had defined Concordia for 7 years had been shattered in a single morning's violence. The question now was what Rose intended to do with her captive, and whether the retaliation from Black Dawn would destroy what remained of the city's fragile stability. Change had come to Concordia with fire and steel, leaving behind only ash and the promise of more violence to come. Chapter 33. The Aftermath. The fallout from the House of Silver Mirrors assault began almost immediately. By midday, Black Dawn forces had cordoned off the entire noble quarter, their nervous energy weapons trained on shadows that might contain threats. The official story emerged in fragments through Cale's network. A terrorist attack by unknown forces, casualties still being assessed, security measures being enhanced. The unofficial story, gathered through his carefully cultivated sources, painted a very different picture. 12 dead, 3 missing, Torres reported during their hastily arranged meeting in the ruins of an old bakery. His weathered face showed the strain of someone trying to process losses that defied military logic. The missing include Lady Vess herself. Missing how? Marcus asked, though Cale already knew the answer. Vanished. No body, no trace, like she was never there. Torres pulled out a small cloth bundle, setting it carefully on the rubble-strewn table between them. But we recovered these from the casualties. Inside the bundle were 2 objects that made Cale's blood run cold. The first was a slug, 2 ounces of metal that had been surgically removed from one of the fallen troopers. But this wasn't conventional ammunition. Intricate runic engravings covered its surface, symbols that seemed to pulse with residual energy even hours after impact. The second object was smaller, a collection of pellets that had clearly come from some kind of shotgun blast. Like the slug, each pellet bore runic engravings, though the symbols were different, more focused, more aggressive in their configuration. "Where did you get these?" Cale asked, though he kept his voice carefully neutral. Medical Corps removed them during casualty processing. The runes? They're unlike anything in our databases. Some kind of enhancement magic that increased the projectile's effectiveness against supernatural defenses. Torres's expression grew troubled. 3 of our enhanced troopers were killed by these weapons. Enhanced troopers that were supposed to be nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks. Eleanor, who'd been examining the artifacts with professional interest, looked up with concern. The runic work is masterful. Whoever created these understood both metallurgy and combat magic at levels that most artificers never achieve. This isn't improvised equipment. This is military-grade enhancement technology. Military from where? Marcus asked. None of the known realms have rune-enhanced ammunition like this. Cale studied the engravings more closely, noting details that his military experience helped him interpret. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were functional, designed to enhance penetration, accuracy, and the kind of devastating impact he'd witnessed in the alley. Earth, he said quietly. These came from Earth. The others stared at him with varying degrees of disbelief. Earth doesn't have this kind of technology, Torres protested. It's a primitive realm. No magic, no supernatural enhancement capabilities. Unless, Cale replied carefully, Earth has been developing capabilities that no one expected. Remember the reports about dire wolves? About humans with military training that could eliminate entire Black Dawn expeditions. The implication hung in the air between them. If Earth had developed weapons that could kill enhanced troopers, if they had technology that combined runic magic with devastating conventional firepower, then the assumptions everyone had made about human limitations were catastrophically wrong. The casualty breakdown, Elena asked. How many were killed by these enhanced weapons versus other methods? Torres consulted notes he'd written in careful shorthand. 7 deaths from the enhanced ammunition. 3 enhanced troopers burned to death by what witnesses described as supernatural fire. 2 regular soldiers killed by conventional magical attacks. And the missing? Lady Vess, as I mentioned, but also 2 servants who were in the administrative wing during the attack. No trace of any of them. Cale filed this information away, understanding its significance better than his companions could. Rose had taken Lady Vess specifically, but the servant's disappearance suggested either collateral kidnapping or elimination to prevent witnesses. Given Rose's demonstrated willingness to kill, he suspected the latter. Command response? Marcus asked. Panic, Torres said bluntly. Lord Draven's refusing to deploy additional forces to Concordia. Says the city's too exposed, too vulnerable to the kind of assault we just witnessed. He's pulling the remaining garrison back to essential positions only. This was exactly what Cale had expected. Draven's paranoia about the pack had been growing for months, and the successful assault on his most secure facility in Concordia would only reinforce his conviction that they were coming for him next. Timeline for the withdrawal? Elena asked. 3 weeks for non-essential personnel, 6 weeks for complete evacuation, except for portal security. Torres's expression grew grim. After that, Concordia's essentially on its own. Skeleton crew to maintain the portal nexus, but no significant military presence. The implications were staggering. After 7 years of occupation, Black Dawn was effectively abandoning the city rather than risk further confrontation with forces they couldn't understand or defeat. The assault on the House of Silver Mirrors hadn't just been a rescue operation. It had been a psychological victory that was reshaping the entire strategic landscape. "What about investigations into the attack?" Cale asked. "Suspended. Command's too worried about additional strikes to spare resources for forensic analysis." Torres rewrapped the ammunition artifacts carefully. Though they did issue one directive: anyone with information about the whereabouts of Lady Vess is to report it immediately. There's apparently significant concern about what she might reveal under interrogation. As their meeting concluded and the others departed to their various duties, Cale remained in the ruins, processing the full scope of what Rose's operation had accomplished. She'd not only rescued Lady Vess, or kidnapped her depending on perspective, but she'd also demonstrated capabilities that had terrified Black Dawn into strategic withdrawal. The enhanced ammunition told a story of technological development that suggested Earth was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. If humans could create weapons that combined runic magic with devastating kinetic force, they represented a threat that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. Most significantly, the successful assault had broken the psychological dominance that Black Dawn had maintained over Concordia for 7 years. Draven's forces were no longer invincible occupiers. They were vulnerable soldiers facing threats they couldn't predict or counter. As Cale made his way home through streets that already felt different, he reflected on how Rose's return had catalyzed changes beyond anything he'd imagined possible. The careful balance he'd worked to maintain, the networks he'd built to protect small communities of vulnerable people, the patient intelligence work that had sustained resistance for years, all of it was being swept aside by forces operating on scales he'd never encountered. The black rose on his windowsill caught the afternoon light, its perfect preservation now seeming almost mocking. Ravina's gift had represented a game between intellectual equals, but Rose's demonstration of power suggested games where intellect mattered less than the ability to reshape reality through superior force. Change was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control, and Cale found himself wondering whether the Concordia that emerged from this chaos would be worth the price being paid to create it. The artifacts Torres had shown him represented more than just advanced weapons. They were proof that the old rules no longer applied, that the comfortable assumptions about power and capability were dissolving in the face of realities no one had prepared for. Tomorrow would bring new intelligence, new challenges, new evidence that the world was becoming something unprecedented. But tonight, Cale sat with the weight of knowledge that made him both more informed and more uncertain than he'd ever been. The shadows were changing again, and this time he wasn't sure anyone would be able to find shelter in them. Chapter 34. Ghosts and Dragons. The intelligence update came through Cale's network in fragments over the following days, each piece adding to a picture that grew more disturbing with every detail. "The servants turned up," Elena reported during their next meeting, relief evident in her voice. "Found them hiding in the wine cellars, scared out of their minds but unharmed. They said they heard the shooting start and immediately went to ground in the deepest part of the building." "Smart," Marcus observed. But why leave them alive? Professional raiders would have eliminated witnesses. Because they weren't raiders, Kale said quietly. They were rescuers, or kidnappers with principles, depending on your perspective. The distinction mattered more than his companions realized. Rose and Darren had demonstrated devastating efficiency against military targets while showing restraint towards civilians. It suggested operational parameters that went beyond simple violence. They were fighting a war, not conducting terrorism. There's more, Torres said, producing a new set of hastily scrawled notes. Intelligence from the Eastern Realms. Lord Draven's facilities on Murkdusk have been hit. Hit how? Elena asked. Ghost attacks, according to the reports. Facilities just going dark. No communication, no survivors, no evidence of what happened. When relief forces arrive, they find empty buildings with all personnel vanished. Torres's weathered face showed the strain of someone trying to process impossible information. 3 major installations in the past week, thousands of troops and researchers just gone. The implications were staggering. If the pack could strike Draven's facilities across multiple realms simultaneously, they possessed capabilities that transcended anything conventional military doctrine could address. Lord Draven's response? Kale asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Complete withdrawal from Murkdusk operations. He's staging at some new realm. Reports suggest it's called Shadowmere, and pulling troops from everywhere to secure whatever he's building there. Torres consulted his notes again. Which brings us to the intelligence from our own troops here in Concordia. The survivors from the house assault? Marcus asked. They're falling apart psychologically. 2 people, Marcus. 2. And they walked through our defences like they weren't there. Enhanced troopers that should have been unstoppable, brought down by weapons that shouldn't exist. Torres leaned forward, his voice dropping despite their secure location. The survivors, they're not handling it well. How so? Elena asked. They keep embellishing what they saw. Sergeant Morrison swears the fire magic was actually dragon breath. Says he saw a full dragon breathing flames that turned stone to glass. Corporal Vex claims there were dire wolves the size of horses involved in the assault. Torres shook his head. Command knows it was just 2 pack members, but the troops can't accept that reality. Kale absorbed this information, understanding the psychological dynamic at play. Black Dawn soldiers had built their identity around overwhelming superiority. Being completely outmatched by just 2 opponents was so devastating to their worldview that their minds were creating explanations that preserved some sense of logic. They can't process being beaten so completely by such a small force, he observed. Exactly. Dragons and dire wolves they can understand, mythical creatures with impossible power. But 2 humans with enhanced weapons. That implies their entire understanding of combat superiority is wrong. Torres consulted his notes again. The really disturbing part is how easily those 2 moved through our security. No alarms until they were already fighting their way out. No detection of their entry. They knew exactly where to go and how to get there. Inside knowledge, Marcus concluded. Has to be. But from who? Lady Vess herself? Someone in her household? Or do they have intelligence capabilities we can't detect? Torres's expression showed the frustration of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Command's response to all this? Kale asked. Panic disguised as strategic redeployment. New standing orders for all Black Dawn forces. Avoid engagement with pack operatives at all costs. Retreat is authorized, regardless of strategic objectives. Torres pulled out an official document bearing command seals. They're classifying the pack as beyond conventional military parameters. The directive represented a complete reversal of everything Black Dawn had stood for during 7 years of expansion. Draven's forces had built their reputation on overwhelming superiority and absolute determination. Now they were being ordered to run from enemies they couldn't understand. The withdrawal timeline from Concordia? Kale pressed. Accelerated? 2 weeks now instead of 6. Lord Draven wants minimal exposure to potential pack operations. Torres gathered his notes carefully. The troops are terrified. These soldiers have never been on the losing side of a battle before, and they definitely never expected to be routed by a two-person assault team. Troop morale? Elena asked. Collapsing. Half of them are jumping at shadows, convinced they're seeing dire wolves in every alley. The other half are so shaken they can barely function. Torres's voice carried exhaustion. When soldiers start seeing dragons where there's just fire magic, you know their psychological state is compromised beyond repair. After the others departed, Kale remained in their meeting place, processing the full scope of what he'd learned. The pack hadn't just conducted a successful operation, they'd broken the psychological backbone of an occupying force through sheer professional competence. 2 people had accomplished what 7 years of resistance efforts couldn't. They'd made Black Dawn afraid. Not just tactically concerned, but genuinely terrified of forces they couldn't comprehend or counter. The enhanced ammunition he'd examined was real evidence of superior technology. But the reports of dragons and dire wolves were just traumatized minds trying to process an impossible defeat. Rose's fire magic became dragon breath because accepting that a single woman could wield such power was too threatening to their sense of military superiority. Most significantly, the rapid withdrawal from Concordia meant that after 7 years of occupation, the city would soon be free, not through popular uprising or external liberation, but because the occupiers were too frightened to remain. As Kale compiled this intelligence, he found himself amazed by the psychological precision of what Rose had accomplished. She hadn't just rescued Lady Vess, she'd demonstrated that Black Dawn's seemingly invincible forces could be defeated by superior skill and technology. The terror spreading through their ranks would do more damage than any conventional military campaign. The black rose on his windowsill caught the evening light, and for the first time in months, it seemed like a token of hope rather than a memorial to impossible games. Rose's war was being fought with weapons and tactics that transcended anything its creator had envisioned. Change was accelerating, but for once it was flowing in directions that offered genuine possibility for liberation. The question was what kind of world would emerge when the shadows finally lifted from Concordia's streets. 2 people had changed everything, the rest remained to be seen. Chapter 35. The Flood. The portals that had remained largely dormant since Draven's systematic destruction of secondary gateways suddenly blazed to life with an intensity that made the air itself hum with magical energy. But these weren't the controlled, measured activations that characterized normal Black Dawn operations. These were desperate emergency transportations, the kind used when retreat was the only option left. Kale felt the disturbance from 3 districts away, the sudden surge of portal energy strong enough to make his teeth ache and the hair on his arms stand on end. He was making his way through the market district when Taven appeared at his elbow, the young man's face flushed with the excitement of someone carrying urgent intelligence. "You need to see this," Taven said breathlessly. "The House of Silver Mirrors, something's happening. Big something." They made their way through the increasingly agitated streets, where even civilians could sense that the magical atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Merchants were closing their stalls early, mothers were calling children inside, and the few Black Dawn patrols still in the city were moving with the nervous energy of soldiers expecting trouble. As they approached the noble quarter, the scope of what was happening became clear. Wounded Black Dawn soldiers were stumbling through the portals in waves. Not the disciplined formations that had characterized 7 years of occupation, but broken, battered troops who looked like they'd fought their way through hell itself. Some supported comrades who could barely walk, others clutched wounds that field medicine couldn't address, and all of them carried the hollow-eyed look of soldiers who'd seen their entire understanding of warfare shattered. "Medical personnel. All available medical personnel to the House of Silver Mirrors, immediately." The call rang out across the district, repeated by runners who spread through the city with desperate urgency. Kale made his decision instantly. His years as a military commander had included extensive field medical training, battlefield medicine, trauma treatment, triage protocols. If Black Dawn was desperate enough to call for civilian medical assistance, they wouldn't question another pair of experienced hands. "I'm going in," he told Taven quietly. "Medical cover, they need help, and I need intelligence." The scene inside the compound was controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers lay in rows across what had once been elegant reception halls, their blood-staining marble floors that had hosted diplomatic functions. Black Dawn medics moved between the casualties with professional efficiency, but they were clearly overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded. A harried medical officer spotted Kale immediately. "You have trauma experience." "Military field medic, border wars," Kale replied, the lie coming easily. It was close enough to truth. His command training had included extensive medical protocols. "Thank the gods. Take the far corner. Enhanced troopers with severe wounds. Our people can't figure out what's causing the tissue damage." Kale moved to the indicated area and immediately understood why the Black Dawn medics were struggling. The enhanced soldiers weren't just wounded, they were ravaged. Massive bite wounds showed the distinctive pattern of predator attacks, with tissue damage that went far beyond what conventional weapons could inflict. "What did this to you?" he asked quietly as he began examining the first casualty, a sergeant whose left arm bore puncture wounds that were clearly from enormous fangs. "Dire wolves," the man gasped, his enhanced physiology struggling to cope with injuries that should have been impossible. "3 of them, size of horses, teeth like swords. But they came out of nowhere. No warning, no approach, we could track." Kale began cleaning the wounds while listening carefully. "No advanced detection." "Nothing. One moment our perimeter was secure, the next moment we were under assault by forces that shouldn't exist." The sergeant gripped Kale's arm weakly. "They just appeared. All of them. Like they materialized out of thin air." Moving to the next casualty, Kale found a corporal with burns that showed the distinctive patterns of magical fire. But fire wielded with surgical precision, rather than random destruction. "These burns," Kale observed as he applied healing salve. "The attackers, how did they get past your defenses?" "That's what terrifies us," the corporal whispered. "There were no alarms, no breach alerts, nothing. Suddenly there were 15 pack members inside our most secure areas, supported by hundreds of human soldiers with enhanced weapons and 200 elves." "They infiltrated somehow?" "No, that's just it. They didn't infiltrate. They appeared. Simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the facility, like they'd been teleported directly into position, but we detected no portal activity, no magical transportation signatures." The corporal's voice carried the hollow tone of someone whose understanding of reality had been shattered. As Kale worked his way through the wounded, the same impossible story emerged from multiple sources. The assault force hadn't approached, hadn't breached perimeters, hadn't used conventional or even magical transportation methods. They had simply appeared inside Eldemir's most secure areas and begun their attack. "The bullets," one wounded soldier told him as Kale treated a chest wound from enhanced ammunition. "The human soldiers materialized with rifles and shotguns, every bullet carved with runes. But how do you defend against an enemy that appears inside your defensive lines without warning?" Another casualty, bearing the distinctive slice marks of elven blades, painted an even more disturbing picture. 200 elves, moving through our positions like they'd been there all along, and the guardians of Alfheim. His voice dropped to a whisper. Guardians that appeared in the heart of our command center like they owned the place. The most severely wounded were those who'd faced the dire wolves directly. Their injuries were catastrophic, massive bite wounds, claw marks that had torn through supposedly impenetrable armor, and psychological trauma that left them unable to coordinate their enhanced reflexes. "The big black wolf materialized right in front of me," one enhanced soldier mumbled as Kale treated deep puncture wounds. No sound, No movement, just suddenly there, looking into my eyes. Took away everything that made me enhanced, left me helpless in my own body. "How many total attackers?" Kale asked, a communications specialist who'd maintained some tactical awareness. "Over 400, appearing simultaneously throughout the facility. No advance warning, no approach signatures, no detection of incoming forces." The specialist's hands shook as he spoke. They just existed where they hadn't existed moments before, then began systematically destroying everything we'd built. "Where exactly did this happen?" Kale asked quietly. The man's eyes darted around nervously before he whispered, "Eldemire. Lord Draven's fortress." They appeared inside our most secure areas like they'd always been there, like reality had been rewritten to include them. As dawn approached and Kale extracted himself from the compound, he carried with him intelligence that challenged everything he thought he understood about warfare, magic, and the nature of reality itself. The pack and their allies hadn't conducted a conventional assault. They had somehow bypassed space, time, or the fundamental laws of physics to appear directly inside Draven's most secure stronghold. The black rose on his windowsill caught the morning light as Kale returned to his quarters, but today it seemed less like a memorial and more like a harbinger of changes that transcended normal understanding. Change had come to the connected realms through means that defied explanation, leaving behind the broken remnants of forces that had thought themselves protected by conventional defensive measures. The shadows were shifting according to rules that no one had written, moved by powers that operated beyond the boundaries of what most considered possible. By late afternoon, Kale had extracted himself from the medical chaos at the House of Silver Mirrors, his mind reeling from the intelligence he'd gathered. The impossibility of what the wounded soldiers described challenged everything he thought he understood about warfare and magic. Forces appearing from nowhere, bypassing all defenses, materializing inside the most secure facility in the connected realms. It defied explanation. The casualty flow had finally slowed to a trickle as the day wore on, but not before over 200 Black Dawn troops had limped through the portals, bearing wounds and trauma that spoke of a defeat so complete it bordered on annihilation. The House of Silver Mirrors, once the symbol of occupation authority, had been transformed into a field hospital for the broken remnants of what had been Draven's elite forces. Kale made his way to the broken shield as evening settled over Concordia, needing the familiar environment to process what he'd learned. The tavern was busier than usual. Word of the strange events at the House of Silver Mirrors had spread throughout the city, creating an undercurrent of tension and speculation among the patrons. He claimed his corner table and ordered his usual ale, then began organizing the intelligence he'd gathered into coherent patterns. The notebook before him filled with details that seemed to contradict the fundamental laws of reality. Over 400 attackers appearing simultaneously inside Eldemire. No portal signatures, no approach detected, no conventional infiltration. 15 pack members, 200+ human soldiers with enhanced weapons, 200 elves, 2 guardians of Alfheim. Dire wolves that could somehow disable enhanced soldiers through eye contact. Coordinated assault that bypassed every defensive measure Draven had established. The more he reviewed the accounts, the more convinced he became that something unprecedented had occurred. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was proof that forces existed with capabilities that transcended normal understanding of space, magic, and warfare itself. Mira approached with his ale, her expression showing the strain everyone in the city was feeling. "Quiet night for you after this morning's excitement?" "Processing," Kale replied, gesturing vaguely at his notes, trying to understand what happened. "Any luck with that?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Because from what I'm hearing, it's got everyone from the market vendors to the remaining Black Dawn officers completely baffled." Before Kale could respond, the tavern's front door burst open with enough force to slam it against the wall. A young man stumbled inside, his clothes dishevelled, his face flushed with the exertion of someone who'd been running through the city streets. "Lord Draven is dead!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent tavern. "His fortress on Eldermire has fallen!" The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Drinks were set down with trembling hands, and every person in the tavern turned to stare at the messenger. The implications of his words hung in the air like a physical presence. "What did you say?" called out Torres, who'd been drinking quietly near the bar. "Lord Draven!" the messenger repeated, still breathing hard. "Dead. The fortress at Eldermire, completely destroyed. The reports are coming through the portal networks now." A murmur rose from the crowd, voices mixing disbelief with hope, fear with excitement. For 7 years, Lord Draven had been the ultimate authority, the power behind every occupation, every conquest, every systematic transformation of the connected realms. The idea that he was dead seemed too enormous to process. "How?" someone called from the back of the tavern. "The assault this morning. It wasn't just an attack on the fortress. It was an execution." The messenger moved further into the tavern, his words drawing every patron closer. The pack and their allies didn't just defeat Draven's forces, they hunted him down personally. Cale felt his blood chill. The wounded soldiers he'd treated had spoken of an impossible assault, but they'd focused on their own survival rather than larger strategic objectives. If the attack had been specifically designed to eliminate Draven himself? "The pack killed him," Torres asked, his military training focusing on tactical details. "According to the reports, it was the Guardians of Alfheim who delivered the killing blow," the messenger replied. "But the entire assault was coordinated. They appeared inside his private chambers while he was trying to activate some kind of emergency protocol." "Appeared how?" Cale asked, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. The messenger turned toward him, same as everywhere else, just materialized inside his most secure areas. No warning, no detection, like they'd always been there. His voice dropped with awe. "The reports say one moment he was alone in his command center, the next moment he was facing 2 Guardians of Alfheim with the full pack backing them up." The tavern erupted in excited conversation as the full implications began to sink in. Lord Draven, the conqueror of realms, the architect of systematic occupation, the power that had reshaped the connected worlds, was dead. His fortress was destroyed, his elite forces scattered, his empire suddenly leaderless. But Cale found himself focusing on different implications. If Draven was dead and his fortress destroyed, what would happen to Ravina? She was still captive somewhere, held by forces that had just demonstrated they could kill the most powerful warlord in the connected realms. More immediately, what would happen to the Black Dawn forces throughout occupied territories? Without Draven's authority, and with their most elite units devastated, would they attempt to maintain control? Or would the entire structure of occupation collapse? "What about the other realms?" someone called out. "What's happening to the other occupied territories?" "Too early to tell," the messenger replied. "But communications throughout the Black Dawn network are in chaos. Some commanders are trying to maintain order, others are abandoning their positions. It's complete collapse." As the evening wore on and more messengers arrived with additional details, a clearer picture emerged. Draven's death had triggered exactly the kind of systematic collapse that Cale had observed in other military organizations when their command structure was eliminated. Without the central authority that had held the empire together, individual commanders were making their own decisions about whether to fight, flee, or surrender. Most significantly for Concordia, the wounded Black Dawn forces at the House of Silver Mirrors were now effectively stranded. Their chain of command had been eliminated, their base of operations destroyed, and their purpose for being in the city had evaporated, along with their empire. The black rose on Cale's windowsill would soon be joined by other flowers. tokens of an ending that few had dared to hope for, but which had arrived with a swiftness that defied belief. As he made his way home through streets that already felt different, Cale reflected on how completely the world had changed in a single day. The careful intelligence networks he'd built, the patient resistance he'd maintained, the small victories he'd achieved over 7 years, all of it had been rendered moot by forces operating on scales he'd never imagined. Change had come to the connected realms not through gradual resistance or political maneuvering, but through the systematic application of impossible capabilities against targets that had thought themselves untouchable. The shadows were lifting from Concordia's streets, but what would emerge in the light remained to be seen. Cale had barely settled into his chair with his notes and a cup of tea when the urgent pounding began. 3 heavy strikes, a pause, then 3 more. But this wasn't the careful coded knock of his network contacts. This was someone who needed immediate attention and didn't care about operational security. He approached the door cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his hip. When he opened it, he found Taven standing there, the young man's face flushed with exertion and his eyes wide with something approaching panic. "Cale! You need to hear this," Taven said breathlessly, pushing past him into the room. "Something's happened at the House of Silver Mirrors. Something impossible." "The wounded soldiers?" Cale asked, closing the door behind him. "Gone. All of them. Every single Black Dawn trooper that was there for medical treatment." Taven moved to the window, as if expecting to see evidence of whatever had occurred. "I was maintaining observation like you asked, watching the compound from the old bakery ruins." "Gone how? Evacuated through the portals?" "That's just it. There was a woman, called herself Syrian, showed up about 3 hours ago with no escort, no guards, just walked right up to the main entrance like she owned the place." Taven's voice carried the bewilderment of someone who'd witnessed something that defied explanation. Cale felt his attention sharpen. "Describe her." "Maybe 40 years old, dark hair, expensive clothes but travel-worn. Moved like someone who expected to be obeyed without question." Taven paused, gathering his thoughts. But here's the strange part. The moment she arrived, the wounded soldiers started organizing themselves. Not like they were being forced. More like they suddenly understood this was their best option. "She convinced them to leave?" "More than convinced. I watched through the scope Henrik made for me. She spoke with the senior officers for maybe 20 minutes. Then suddenly, every Black Dawn soldier in the compound was preparing for departure. Even the ones who could barely walk were being helped into formation." Cale moved to his own window, extending his awareness toward the portal networks, as he'd learned to do over years of monitoring magical activity in the city. What he sensed made his blood chill. Nothing. The constant background hum of active portals that had characterized Concordia for as long as he could remember was simply gone. "The portals, Taven. Can you sense them?" The young man paused, his face growing pale as he realized what Cale was asking. "They're not there. All of them. The main nexus, the secondary gates, even the emergency routes. It's like they never existed." "When did this happen?" "Right after the woman, Syrian, led the last of the Black Dawn troops through a portal she opened herself. The moment it closed behind them, every other portal connection just died." Taven's voice dropped to a whisper. "Cale were cut off, completely cut off from every other realm." The implications cascaded through Cale's mind like dominoes falling. Concordia had been severed from the network of connected realms, isolated as completely as if it had been transported to another dimension entirely. "How many soldiers did she take?" he asked. "All of them. Over 200 wounded troops, plus the medical staff, plus the remaining guards. She opened this massive portal, bigger than anything I've ever seen. And they all walked through in perfect order." Taven shook his head in amazement. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. What was? She knew they were coming, had the portal configuration ready, had transport arrangements prepared, like she'd been planning this evacuation for weeks. But how could she know? Draven only died this morning. Kale considered this carefully. If this Syrian had been prepared to evacuate Black Dawn forces before Draven's death was even confirmed, it suggested she had advanced knowledge of events that few others possessed. Did she say anything? Give any indication of her authority or purpose? That's the thing. She didn't act like someone seeking authority. She acted like someone who already had more authority than anyone else in the area could challenge. Taven moved away from the window, his nervous energy filling the small room. The Black Dawn officers didn't question her, didn't demand credentials, didn't even seem surprised by her arrival, like they'd been expecting her. And after they left? The portal sealing happened immediately, not gradually, not with warning, just suddenly every connection to other realms was cut. Taven's expression grew troubled. Kale, what if this isn't temporary? What if whoever this woman represents has decided Concordia needs to be permanently isolated? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully consider. After 7 years of occupation, after witnessing the collapse of Draven's empire, after seeing the emergence of forces that could reshape reality itself, Concordia had been removed from the game entirely. Any sign of this Syrian after the evacuation? Kale asked. None. Once the last portal closed, she just disappeared. Didn't leave through any exit I could observe, didn't use any transportation I could detect. Just gone, like she'd never been there. Taven paused. Though there was something else. Right before the portals sealed, I could have sworn I saw her looking directly at my observation post, like she knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. As Taven departed to spread word through what remained of their network, Kale found himself alone with the magnitude of what had occurred. Concordia was now completely isolated from the connected realms, its portal network severed by someone with the authority and capability to make such decisions unilaterally. But as the initial shock wore off, he began to consider the implications more carefully. For the first time in 7 years, Concordia was truly free, not liberated through conquest or revolution, but isolated in a way that made external interference impossible. The black rose on his windowsill caught moonlight from his window, and for the first time since Ravina had left it there, it seemed like a token of completion rather than an ongoing obligation. Change had come to Concordia one final time, delivered by a mysterious woman who had appeared just long enough to remove the city from games too dangerous for anyone to win. The question was what kind of world they would build in their splendid isolation, and whether whoever had arranged that isolation would be content to let them build it in peace. Chapter 36. The Impossible Portal. 3 days had passed since Syrian's mysterious evacuation of the Black Dawn forces, and Concordia felt like a city holding its breath. The absence of patrol boots on cobblestones, the silence where portal energy had once hummed constantly, it all created an atmosphere of suspension, as if the entire realm waited for whatever would fill the sudden vacuum. Kale sat in his corner of the broken shield, nursing his usual ale while processing the intelligence that had filtered through his network over the past 72 hours. The reports painted a picture of a city in transition, former Black Dawn sympathizers going to ground, criminal elements testing the boundaries of the new reality, and ordinary citizens beginning to venture into districts that had been off-limits for 7 years. But it was Taven who brought the news that changed everything. The young man slipped through the tavern's back entrance with the controlled urgency that meant significant intelligence. He approached Kale's table with casual movements that belied the tension in his shoulders. "You need to hear this," Taven said quietly, settling into the chair across from him. "Something happened in the artisan quarter about an hour ago. Something impossible." Kale set down his ale with deliberate calm. "Define impossible." A portal opened. Not like the Black Dawn rifts, not like anything we've seen before. Just tore reality apart in Miller's Alley, and someone stepped through. Taven's voice carried the bewilderment of someone whose understanding of the world had been challenged. The portal network's been dead for 3 days. Nothing in, nothing out. But this just appeared from nowhere. Cale felt his pulse quicken, though he kept his expression neutral. Who came through? 3 people. A woman with dark hair, moves like she owns whatever ground she's standing on. A blonde elf in leather armor who scanned for threats like a professional killer. And, Taven paused, his voice dropping further, Lady Vess. Lady Vess, who disappeared months ago when the House of Silver Mirrors was attacked. The pieces clicked into place in Cale's mind with uncomfortable clarity. Someone had returned to Concordia with the ability to bypass portal restrictions that had left the entire realm isolated, and they'd brought Lady Vess with them, the woman from the House of Silver Mirrors' assault. What happened after they arrived? Cale asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. They didn't linger, moved through the alley like they knew exactly where they were going. I followed at a distance. They headed toward the old noble district. Taven leaned closer. But here's the strange part. The portal didn't just close, it sealed itself, like reality healed over the wound it had made. Any magical signature before it opened? Energy build-up? Warning signs? Nothing I could detect. One moment empty air, the next moment a gateway that shouldn't exist. Taven's expression grew troubled. It was like the portal opened from outside our reality entirely. Where specifically in the noble district? Cale asked. That's where I lost them. They turned down Sage Street toward Master Chen's old estate, but... Taven shrugged apologetically. You know how those old wards work. Can't get close enough to see much without triggering alarms. Cale's mind raced. Master Chen's estate remained one of the most magically protected locations in Concordia. Its defences maintained by Jiro even years after the Master's death. The fact that these strangers had headed there specifically suggested either intimate knowledge of the property or confidence that they could bypass protections that had stymied every other attempt at entry. Any activity visible from the street? He asked. Lights in some of the windows. That's about all you can see from outside the ward perimeter. Taven paused. Though there was something odd. When they approached the main gate, it just opened, like it recognized them. This detail sent a chill through Cale. Master Chen's estate didn't simply open for anyone. Its magical locks required specific knowledge or authorization that very few people possessed. For the gate to open willingly for strangers suggested capabilities that challenged everything he understood about the property's defenses. As Taven departed and the evening progressed, more fragmentary intelligence filtered through Cale's network. A street sweeper had seen 3 figures walking with purpose through the noble district. A night watchman reported unusual activity around the estate's perimeter, lights where there had been darkness for years. But it was Marcus who brought the detail that made everything click into place. I know who the woman is, Marcus said during their late-night meeting in the ruins of the old granary. His weathered face showed the strain of someone processing impossible information. Took me hours to place her, but I finally remembered. Who? Cale asked, though something in his chest was already tightening with recognition. Rose Emberheart, the information broker who disappeared the night before Black Dawn arrived. Marcus leaned forward. She's back, Cale. After 7 years, Rose Emberheart has returned to Concordia. The revelation hit Cale like a physical blow. Rose Emberheart, the woman who'd controlled half of Concordia's information networks before the occupation, who'd vanished mysteriously when Draven's forces approached, who'd been one of the few people capable of coordinating effective resistance. You're certain? Cale asked. Positive. I worked security for some of her operations before the occupation. That bearing, that way of moving, it's her. Marcus's expression grew troubled. But she's different. Harder. Like 7 years away from Concordia changed her into something more dangerous. As the pieces fell into place, Cale began to understand the true significance of what had occurred. Rose Emberheart hadn't just returned, she'd returned with capabilities that allowed her to bypass the portal lockdown that had isolated Concordia from the connected realms. She'd brought Lady Vess, the woman who'd been kidnapped from the House of Silver Mirrors months ago, and she'd claimed Master Chen's estate as if she had every right to be there. The woman who'd once been Concordia's most effective information broker had evolved into something far more powerful during her years of absence. And now she was back, at a moment when the city was leaderless and vulnerable to whoever could establish control first. "What do we know about her companion?" Kael asked. "The elf?" "Professional killer, no question." Watched the perimeter while Rose conducted business, but she deferred to Rose's authority without question. Marcus consulted his hastily scrawled notes. Though there was something strange about how they interacted. The elf was completely loyal, but Rose kept distance between them, like she trusted her but didn't like her. Kael filed this observation away as potentially significant. Tension between allies often revealed vulnerabilities that could become relevant. Current status at the estate. Quiet, but active. Lights in the main house, signs of occupation, but no obvious activity visible from the street. Marcus paused. Though one of the market vendors mentioned something odd, the wards around the property feel different, stronger. This confirmed Kael's growing assessment that Rose had returned with capabilities far beyond what she'd possessed as an information broker. Strengthening Master Chen's already formidable magical protections suggested either extensive magical knowledge or access to resources that transcended normal limitations. As he made his way home through streets that felt different each night, Kael reflected on the implications of Rose's return. She wasn't just another power player seeking to fill the vacuum left by Black Dawn's evacuation. She was someone with a legitimate claim to influence in Concordia, backed by capabilities that had allowed her to survive and apparently thrive during 7 years in exile. The question was what she intended to do with those capabilities and whether her purposes aligned with Concordia's interests or represented new threats the city wasn't prepared to handle. The black rose on his windowsill caught moonlight as he settled into his chair to document the day's intelligence. Ravina's gift had represented one kind of game, intellectual challenges between worthy opponents. Rose's return suggested a different kind of game entirely, one where the stakes were measured in the future of his city rather than the satisfaction of solving puzzles. For the first time in 7 years, Kael found himself facing someone whose capabilities and intentions remained largely unknown, but whose very presence changed everything about Concordia's political landscape. Rose Emberheart was back, and whatever she'd become during her years away, it was something that could bypass impossible barriers and claim ancient strongholds as if they were hers by right. The game in Concordia was beginning again, but this time Kael wasn't sure whether he was observing it or already playing it.